Thank you, Asta. In the HBO TV adaptation of the book Big Little Lies, there's a scene where a second grader, Amabella, suffers a panic attack after a class discussion about climate change. Now, Amabella's family thought that climate change was too grave of a subject to be discussed with children. So while the mother knew how to protect her from most other dangers of this world, this was a problem where she was not in control. So instead, Amabella's mother stormed to the school and took her anger out on the teacher who had brought up such a terrifying subject with the children. Amabella is a typical member of Generation Z, raised by parents who did everything they could to keep their children safe and happy. And nonetheless, Generation Z is growing up more anxious, more depressed, more lonely, and more distrusting than any other generation before them. I have studied Generation Z since before some of them were even born. And this is the trend that troubles me the most. I suspect that in our efforts to try to understand what are the causes for these rising mental health crises with our kids, we might be looking for causes in the wrong places, or at the very least, overlook some plausible explanations that are a little less obvious. In this talk, I hope to shed light on some of those explanations and possibly introduce some solutions. Generation Z took their baby steps in the last half of the 1990s and throughout the 2000s, at the beginning of an era of rapid change, a time when a multitude of global trends came together and accelerated at the same time. Globalization had shrunk the world, and new information and communication technologies connected us in ways that hadn't been possible before. Parents logged onto what we then called the information superhighway, and were constantly reminded of all the possible threats that might be hiding around the corner. Cable news and emerging internet communities amplified these fears. And constantly now, on the parents' minds were child abductions, playground accidents, food allergies, and all sorts of possible harms that are frightening, but statistically fairly rare. The result of this is that Generation Z, to a large extent, has grown up in their bedrooms. The number of teenagers who meet up with their friends every single day dropped in half since 1980, and even more during the pandemic. Now, that doesn't mean that Generation Z is any less connected. With the world literally at their fingertips, they are learning to navigate a pixelated reality, one where physical rooms have given way to virtual rooms, and where they're constantly soaking in a constant onslaught of information 24/7. Now, it might be that growing up protected from the occasional boogeyman on the street corner and scraped knees on the playground is not the best recipe for happiness or even safety. Experts are now wondering why Generation Zers have the second leading cause of death of young people today is suicide. You can now actually read long academic articles and best-selling books from social psychologists who are starting to wonder what is going on. What is going on with our kids today? And parents who are already worried, now they worry even more. Now we blame the technology. Now we blame the touch screens, the smartphones, the tablets, the social media networks, and the video gaming platforms. You can now even hear from Silicon Valley executives who will publicly admit that they will not let their own kids have the very same technology that they are creating for others. I suspect, though, that once again, we might be looking for a simple explanation, a single variable to try to explain all the misery. Now, there is a relationship between screen time, or at least social media, and depression. But the effect isn't any large enough to explain all the misery. And when we look at this relationship, we don't even know if it is that social media causes depression or if depressed people spend more time on social media. Perhaps it is then that we're taking our worst behaviors online, maybe. But if we compare all the negative interactions with the positive interactions we have through these devices, do we even know that the bad outweighs the good? During a talk that I had on Generation Z and their technology use a few years ago, a woman in my audience stood up to share her story. Now, as a mother, she too had worried about the effect of the screens on her family. So she introduced screen time rules where at a certain hour every evening, all the family members were to drop their phones into a basket and not reclaim it until the next day. Now, one of these nights, her daughter's best friend had tried to reach out during his darkest hour. When he wasn't able to make contact, he ended up trying to end his own life. What a wicked twist of fate that this technology that our experts had warned us could cause suicidal proclivities was now in fact the communication device that could help prevent it. Now, thankfully, he did survive, but it is a stark reminder that technology itself is neither good or bad. It's how we use it that really matters. Now, I want you to think back on that story I told you about Amabella and the teacher who had been blamed for bringing up such a frightening subject like climate change. Just like the teacher, the Generation Z's technology is really a messenger of bad news, but not the direct cause of it. If we shift our focus away from the symptoms and start digging for the underlying causes, perhaps what we might find out is that these screens are conveying a reality that is happening outside, simply mediating messages of things that are happening in the real world. Like, for example, when we see images of forest fires completely out of control, of coral reef dying in the ocean, of the constant reminders that species are going extinct by the dozens every single day. Wouldn't it be plausible to assume that this reality has an effect on mental health? Psychiatrist and environmentalist Lisa von Susteren has looked at the relationship between climate change and mental health. She describes this as a pre-traumatic stress condition, which really is about fear of something you feel you cannot control, something that is bound to happen, but you cannot influence. In many ways, it's the opposite of post-traumatic stress, which is the anxiety that is brought on by past trauma. So pre-traumatic stress is in many ways fear of the future. And it's true that it is the younger generations that are going to have to deal with the problems that we're causing today, whether we talk about climate change, resource depletion, mass extinction, water scarcity, pollution, pandemics. We know from international surveys that it's the younger generation that worry about these trends the most. Perhaps then this is the biggest difference between younger generations and their parents. Because again, while their parents did so much to protect them, they can't protect them from the future. But what if that future can be changed? And what if it turns out that those very same technologies that are showing us all of these images of terrible things that are happening in the environment, all of these constant reminders, those technologies are also the devices that are connecting young people in unprecedented levels of activism. Now, what if that activism is also the best remedy to replace the sense of despondency and despair with hope and empowerment? 2 years ago, this month, over 1.5 million kids in 125 countries took to the streets to protest what they felt was an inadequate response to the problems of climate change. This was made possible through the connectivity that this generation enjoys. And it's this connectivity that is helping them build momentum around common values that gives them a very strong global voice. A voice that is in fact becoming so powerful that big international corporations are now starting to listen and actually make changes to the practices to appeal to this hyper-connected, hyper-influential, and very digital generation. These businesses, they know that young people with smartphones can dig up any smut that could tarnish their reputation or bring viral fame to brands that live up to their expectations. So perhaps in spite of all of their anguish, Generation Z is the most powerful. So what should you do? If you have a teenager who seems glued to the screens, should you install screen lock apps or spying apps or all of these? Should you count the second and hours that they spend online? Or might you have better results if you actually engage in more conversations about what it is that they are doing on the screens, what that they're seeing, how does it make them feel, what gives them hope, how do they feel that they can make a changes to their future? Because the truth is, we might not be able to protect our children from everything that is worrying them or worrying us. Our greatest fear might in fact be that we don't have much control at all, just like Amabella's mother. And it's tempting then to think that if we could just keep our kids inside, we can keep them safe. Or if we take their phones away, they'll be happier. But shutting off the world outside isn't going to solve anything, whether we shut it off physically or digitally. And it's really only going to prolong the time it takes before we deal with the real issues that are scary because they're tied to the future of our planet, a future that our children are so determined to change. So if we really want to help our kids heal, let's start by being honest with ourselves. Let's start by accepting that mental health is linked to the health of our planet. And let's join that global voice for change. Thank you.